let's dive straight into a really fascinating clash of ideas today.
Sounds good.
You might have seen this YouTube discussion doing the rounds featuring the physicist Michio Kaku.
Ah, yes, I know the one you mean.
He made this pretty surprising claim, basically arguing that the certainty of both theists and atheists flawed.
Right, and the real kicker was him saying that there is no God is not scientific. That really stirred things up.
Exactly. It throws a huge wrench into the whole science versus faith debate.
Oh.
So that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive, that tension, looking specifically at agnosticism and atheism through this lens.
And it's interesting because Kaku's coming at it from a physics perspective, challenging the grounds on which, a lot of these arguments usually happen.
Definitely. So our source material here is twofold. We've got that YouTube discussion itself, Kaku, Richard Dawkins, William Craig. Quite the lineup.
Heavy hitters, for sure.
And then, adding another important layer, there's a response article on Medium by Jorge Guerra Pires, a Ph.D. He respects Kaku, clearly, but really takes issue with this specific point about atheism.
So a direct counter-argument. Excellent.
Yeah. So, for you listening, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to join us figuring out these arguments. We want to get a handle on the different viewpoints, the science, the philosophy, belief, non-belief.
And hopefully without getting too bogged down in jargon.
Right. We'll touch on things like Kaku's unicorn metaphor, which is memorable to say the least. We'll look at Einstein's view on God, maybe even this idea of cosmic music from string theory. But yeah, keeping it accessible.
It really gets to fundamental questions, doesn't it? How we know what we know, the limits of science, our whole understanding of the universe, really.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into Kaku's core argument. From that YouTube chat, he's framing himself as, agnostic.
Meaning the whole God question is basically unknowable, at least for certain.
Exactly. He thinks the strong atheist saying universe is pointless, no God, and the strong theist saying universe is purposeful, my God exists. Both are making flawed claims, scientifically speaking.
And his reasoning boils down to how he defines science itself.
Right. For Kaku, science deals with statements that are, and this is his list, decidable, testable, reproducible, and falsifiable.
That's a pretty standard definition in, say, physics. Empirical testing is key.
And when he looks at the God question, or the meaning of the universe question, he says they just don't fit. They're undecidable using that scientific toolkit.
Okay.
And that's where the unicorns come in. His analogy. How do you prove unicorns don't exist?
Right. You can't search everywhere, every possible dimension or hidden island. Proving a negative is logically really, really difficult.
So absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, in his view.
That's the crux of it for that analogy.
Then he brings in Einstein, which is interesting. Says Einstein had these two ideas of God. One was the personal God. The other one who steps in, answers prayers, maybe gets vengeful. Kaku says Einstein didn't buy that one.
Right. That's a common understanding of Einstein's views.
But then there's the God of Spinoza and Einstein. This is more about harmony, beauty, elegance in the universe's laws, something that suggests it wasn't all just, random chance.
Ah, so more of a philosophical sense of order rather than an active deity.
Yeah. And Kaku himself says, look, I don't see God in the physics equations. But crucially, he adds, that doesn't prove there isn't some underlying principle or something.
So he's leaving the door open, philosophically.
Seems like it. And this leads him to his own field, string theory. He calls it really interesting territory. Says it's a potential candidate for the theory of everything.
The single equation Einstein was looking for, yeah, that's the holy grail for many physicists.
And then he uses this very evocative metaphor,
Yeah,
linking it to the mind of God. He describes it as cosmic music resonating through 11-dimensional hyperspace.
Wow, okay. That's poetic. Less a scientific claim, more an expression of awe at the complexity physics is revealing.
I think that's fair. It's about the sheer elegance and depth of the potential underlying reality.
Okay, so that's Kaku's general position. Agnostic based on the limits of testable science, but open to a sort of Spinoza God of order, finding hints of that in the beauty of physics like string theory.
Right. Now let's switch gears to Jorge Guerra Pires' response. He starts respectfully acknowledging Kaku's work.
What?
But he immediately says he strongly disagrees with Kaku's claim that saying there is no God is not scientific.
Okay, so a direct challenge. What's his reasoning?
Well, first he suggests Kaku's definition of science might be a bit too narrow, maybe too physics-centric. He points to biology, for instance. It's scientific, rigorous, but maybe less mathematically precise in some areas. deals more with probabilities.
That's a fair point. Science isn't monolithic in its methods across all disciplines.
Exactly. And Pires flatly rejects Kaku's core statement. He aligns himself more with someone like Richard Dawkins.
Ah, okay. So Pires thinks the God question can be approached scientifically.
Yes, at least in parts. He argues that some aspects, like, say, the effectiveness of prayer or specific creation stories, could potentially be tested or evaluated against evidence.
So not the ultimate nature of a deity, perhaps, but specific claims made by religions.
Precisely. Pires also raises a really interesting point about how the whole debate often centers on the God of the Bible.
Which he calls a bad source. Strong words.
Yeah. He means it's just one specific tradition, and often the focus ignores the huge diversity of other religions. Like, he mentions Buddhism, some forms of which don't have a God figure at all.
True. The discussion does tend to be very Abrahamic-centric.
So Pires argues atheism actually offers a consistent stance here by, well, rejecting all these specific, often contradictory religious claims, saying essentially, you are all wrong.
Okay, so challenging the premise and broadening the scope. Got it.
Now let's circle back to those unicorns. Pires tackles that analogy head on.
What's his take?
He gets Kaku's logical point about proving a negative. Fine. But he says the analogy fails dramatically on ethical grounds.
How so?
Because, as Pires puts it quite powerfully, no one kills in the name of the unicorn.
Ooh, yeah, that's a crucial difference.
Beliefs about God have massive real-world consequences. Social, political violence. Comparing it to an invisible pink unicorn just doesn't hold up because belief in a God dictating morals isn't neutral. It has weight. It has impact.
That's a very strong ethical counterpoint to the purely logical analogy.
And tied to this is the burden of proof. Pires brings up Bertrand Russell's teapot.
The celestial teapot. Classic.
Right. If I say there's a teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars, too small to see, you can't disprove it.
But it's completely unreasonable to believe it without any evidence for it.
Exactly. Pires says the burden is always on the person making the extraordinary claim. So that line, you can't prove God doesn't exist, is just trying to shift the burden incorrectly.
It's a logical fallacy, basically. Lack of proof against isn't proof for.
Okay, so that demolishes the unicorn analogy's applicability pretty effectively. Then Pires clarifies what atheism for most people actually is.
Which is important because it gets misrepresented a lot.
He argues it's primarily a philosophical stance. It's a lack of belief in gods.
Not necessarily an absolute positive assertion that no gods exist anywhere.
Right. It's more like the default position. I don't see convincing evidence, so I don't believe. It's skepticism.
Which sounds, well, pretty scientific in its approach, actually. Withholding belief pending evidence.
That's Pires' point. He says demanding atheism meet the same falsifiability criteria as a specific scientific hypothesis is kind of missing the point, confusing categories.
Like asking if skepticism itself is falsifiable.
Yeah. Are we being unscientific because we lack belief in unicorns or Russell's teapot? Pires says no, that's just rational skepticism based on zero evidence.
So atheism as a rational stance grounded in lack of evidence, not necessarily needing its own empirical proof of non-existence.
Exactly. Now, what about Kaku's question? Who created the equations that describe the Big Bang?
Ah, yes, hinting at a designer behind the mathematical laws.
Pires sees this as basically an argument from ignorance. Just because we don't fully understand the origin of physical laws doesn't automatically mean the answer is God.
The God of the gaps argument, we don't know, therefore God.
Right. And Pires adds that equations are our descriptions of observed patterns. They're human constructs to understand reality, not necessarily pre-existing blueprints.
Though the question of why the laws are the way they are is a deep philosophical one, of course. But jumping to a designer is a leap. Pires argues isn't supported by evidence.
Okay. And on using Einstein, Pires makes sure to clarify. Yes, Einstein used the word God, but explicitly rejected a personal God.
Context matters. It was often about cosmic order, awe.
And Pires reminds us, plenty of top scientists, Russell, Sagan, Feynman, Hawking, were atheists or naturalists. It clearly didn't stop them from doing groundbreaking science.
That undermines any suggestion that you need religious belief to be a great scientist.
Definitely. Then Pires raises a broader concern about what he calls a mystic turn in some science communication.
Meaning?
Scientists sometimes hinting at cosmic intelligence or purpose, kind of blurring the lines between solid science and, well, personal speculation.
Ah, yeah. Using the authority of science to lend weight to ideas that aren't actually testable or proven.
Exactly. Pires stresses the need for clarity. Distinguish what's known scientifically from metaphysical ideas. don't muddy the waters.
That's a really important point about responsible science communication, maintaining intellectual honesty.
And his final main point really circles back to the beginning. Portraying atheism as this dogmatic, absolute claim that no God exists anywhere is usually a straw man.
Misrepresenting the actual position of most atheists.
Right. He reiterates, for most, it's simply that lack of belief due to lack of evidence, which, he argues, is a fundamentally scientific and skeptical stance.
So a position of humility in the face of insufficient data, rather than arrogant certainty.
That sums it up nicely. Okay, so bringing this deep dive together.
Yeah.
We had Kaku's agnostic view, rooted in the idea that science has limits, it can't test the God hypothesis, illustrated by his unicorn analogy. Then we had Pires hitting back hard, defending atheism philosophically, critiquing Kaku's definition of science, pointing out the ethical flaws in the unicorn analogy, stressing the burden of proof.
And defining atheism primarily as that skeptical stance, a lack of belief, which he sees as very much aligned with scientific thinking.
Yeah, the core tension really seems to be about those limits of science versus the role of evidence. Kaku focuses on what science can't test, framing agnosticism as the logical result.
While Pires focuses on the lack of positive evidence for God claims, arguing that non-belief is therefore the rational default, especially given the real-world impact of those claims.
It really is you thinking.
It does. And that leads to our final thought for you to chew on. Considering these different takes, Kaku's emphasis on the limits of scientific proof versus Pires' emphasis on the burden of evidence, what do you find more compelling?
Does the fact that science can't definitively prove or disprove something like God automatically put belief and non-belief on equal footing? Or does the lack of positive evidence and who holds the burden of proof tilt the scales rationally?
It's a deep question about how we weigh different kinds of arguments when faced with the ultimate unknowns.
Definitely something to mull over. We hope this unpackaging has given you some food for thought. Feel free to check out the sources and keep exploring.